All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my friend Micah Uetricht. Micah is an assistant editor at Jacobin Magazine. He is also a contributing editor at In These Times. You can find him on Twitter at Micah Uetricht. Micah, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Glad to be back.
All right, so Micah, you actually recently wrote a really great piece at Al Jazeera America on how the new school year is actually one of great anxiety for Chicago school parents. Why don't you tell us all about it?
Sure. So there are two major things that have happened in the past year that are the source of anxiety, I think, for a lot of parents that have caused a lot of upheaval in schools throughout the city. The one got a lot of national attention when it happened at the time, which was the closure of 49 elementary schools and the high school program. It was done not as in past years when closures were meted out to schools that weren't performing well academically according to standardized tests or a number of different metrics, but rather, according to what the district said, was underutilization, that these schools had supposedly had empty classrooms and they weren't being used, and they needed to be closed in order to fill the district's budget deficit, which it says is $1 billion. So 50 schools in total were closed, almost all of which were in African-American neighborhoods on the south and west side of the city. So there was that happened, which is obviously an incredibly disruptive sort of upheaval to a lot of people's lives, especially in neighborhoods where schools are a real primary and one of the only institutions that are a real anchor to the community. So that happened earlier in this year. And at the same time that happened, the Chicago Public Schools voted or announced that it would be doing new kind of funding of the schools that would be a shift to pure per pupil funding, which means that for every student that's in a school, you get a set amount of money, and based on the amount of students you have, a principal at a school gets to decide, what to do with that money, basically, which sounds like a sort of sensible thing, but in reality, it's led to a massive amount of budget cuts in schools, not only in neighborhoods like where the school closures happened, in neighborhoods of color and poor neighborhoods, but throughout the city, and even in some of the city's wealthiest neighborhoods and most high-performing schools. 1,700 teachers were initially laid off as part of the layoffs of over 3,000 CPS staff, which has led to a number of things that we can get into. But so those are the two main things that have happened basically at the same time: school closures and these huge budget cuts that are leading to layoffs of teachers.
Before we get to some of the kind of the consequences and what this actually means, because what it means is actually really devastating for a lot of communities and for a lot of families in Chicago. I also want to make sure we point out we've covered the Chicago the fights for the Chicago public schools for quite some time, and Rahm Emanuel's racist war against this against the Chicago public schools. But again, just want to make sure if people aren't really following the story, how much of what Rahm and his hand-chosen board have done has actually been based on a lot of false information and information that many people contend is actually they're lying about a lot of this stuff, and while they're cutting from Chicago public schools, spending millions of dollars to build a stadium for DePaul, a private university at that, also using the TIF money for that, using having all this money being funneled into charter schools, which many people obviously think that Emanuel really wants to replace public schools with charter schools.
Sure.
So briefly cover some of the big falsities of the Emanuel administration and his board's attacks on public schools.
Sure. So Mayor Rahm Emanuel is pretty unabashedly trying to institute a much more kind of neoliberal, free market, style of urban governance in Chicago, and there's no disputing that. And schools have been where this has been played out, I think, in starkest relief, perhaps. And so, there have been the teachers union and many community groups have hotly disputed a lot of the district's claims. For example, the stadium that you referenced, the DePaul University basketball stadium. There is a kind of public financing method that is used in Chicago called tax increment financing, which stands for TIF. And it's sort of a complex method, but basically in a given TIF district, a certain amount of money is taken from taxes in that district, and it goes into this general fund called the TIF fund. And that its initial purpose was to alleviate blight, quote unquote. So, kind of in theory, a good sort of redistributive policy in that it would take money from some districts and give it to areas of the city that really need it. In practice in Chicago, what it's meant is that the previous mayor, Mayor Richard Daley, and Rahm Emanuel have essentially a slush fund that allows them to do whatever they want with what they say is $1.7 billion in TIF money. What the city itself says is how much money they have in this fund. And so there's all this money that it normally would be going to any kind of general public project like schools or parks or libraries. Instead, it's sitting in this fund, and what the city has done with that money in recent years is give it away to, Miller Coors, the beer conglomerate who got a bunch of money when they moved their offices here, a posh luxury hotel in the South Loop. And in the case of this DePaul Stadium, $55 million was going to an arena, for DePaul University, which is a private Catholic university, for their basketball team, which currently plays in a sort of far-flung, not super far-flung, like kind of first-ring suburb in the city. So this is, $55 million that could be used for schools who have a huge budget deficit, but instead is being given to help build a stadium for a private university, right? And so there's this kind of stuff is happening. Many activists in the city have demanded that Emanuel declare what's called a TIF surplus, which would allow some of that $1.7 billion to be given to these schools to make up for these huge budget cuts that are happening. The district says that they're carrying out $68 million worth of budget cuts. These independent groups, I think there was a former CPS employee who did his own report that found that there are over $180 million in cuts that are happening. And the number is sort of disputed because, as you mentioned, charter schools have become this really big issue in Chicago. So at the same time that these 50 schools have been closed, the city is moving ahead on its plan that it signed on to a few years ago to open 60 new charter schools by 2017, which is a bit sort of mind-boggling to think about, that if we have this real crisis of underutilized schools, right, which is the whole reason why these 50 schools needed to be closed in the first place, is because nobody was going to them, so we got to close them in order to close this budget deficit. But they're willing to move forward on opening 60 new charter schools.
Which costs a ton of money to actually set them up and establish them, and the fact that their employees are non-union and all those problems that stem from that. But the fact that they're able to find this money to build these new charter schools, but they don't have the money to actually help existing public schools.
Exactly, and the reason that number of the total number, the number that this CPS gave versus the estimated $180 million in cuts. The reason that number is disputed is because charter schools are getting a huge bump in the terms of the CPS budget, in terms of the money that's allocated to them. So there are, 100. The district says there's only $68 million worth in cuts. Well, that $68 million in cuts sort of subtracted from the total number of cuts in their mind is the amount of money that they are increasing to charter schools. So the amount of cuts to regular neighborhood schools is over $180 million, while charter schools are getting more money. And of course, as you mentioned, charter schools are non-union. They are often run by private interests, some nonprofit, some for-profit, and they're seen as this way to engage in a kind of backdoor privatization of the public education system. And it's clear in a place like Chicago, where a huge portion of the city's budget, of the public budget, is being given over to these charter schools. So, there's this shift in the budgetary priorities that's going on. And I should mention that even before these last 50 closures happened, the district has been closing a number of, just several dozen schools over the past decade and a half or so. And almost a full 1/3 of those exact buildings that the district has closed in the past have been turned over to charter schools. So not just like, you close a school in X neighborhood on the south side, and then 2 blocks away, a charter school opens up. But literally in the exact same building where the public neighborhood school was, now there is a charter school. So it's very clear what the district agenda here is, and that the accusation from many parents and from the teachers union is that they're using this budget crisis as a way to push forward an agenda of privatization through the spread of charter schools in the city.